Thank you everybody for being here and welcome. My name is Simonetta Moro and I am the director of the Institute for Doctoral Studies in the Visual Arts. One of the first PhD programs in art and philosophy based in Portland, Maine in the United States. And it is my great pleasure to host this event today in partnership with the African Center for the Study of the United States at the University of the Witwatersrand, the African Center for the Study of the United States at the University of Pretoria, and the Villa Lugodi Center for Sculpture at the Nirox Sculpture Park in South Africa. I'm joined here on screen, Professor Olu Oguibe, Artist and Research Fellow at the University of Pretoria, and Dr. Johan Thom, Artist and Coordinator of Fine Art and Postgraduate Studies in Fine Art at the University of Pretoria, who will present today, and also by Carolyn Jean Martin, whom I will briefly introduce shortly, who will moderate the discussion. I am thankful to them and to Sven Christian, the curator of the Nirox Foundation, for being here and for co-hosting this event. And to all our friends at WITS and the University of Pretoria that made this event possible, namely Lisa Creel, Molly Brown, Teboho Lebakeng, Benta Hofmeier of University of Pretoria, Merle Williams and Adam Levin of WITS. And thanks also to Molly Davies for her assistance in coordinating this webinar, and to Angela Lynn Dunlop for her technical assistance. This is the first of two lectures this fall on the question of Africanness in the expanded field of sculpture, the second of which will be held also on Zoom on October 29. So be sure to sign up for that one too. And before we launch into the first introduction, let me go over a few technical details. This webinar will last approximately 90 minutes, including the Q&A. We'll take questions from the audience following the presentations, which should last some 20 minutes each. Please write your questions in a dedicated Q&A box so that Carolyn Jean Martin may select them and read them out loud. Thank you. Feel free to put your name down if you wish. And please don't use the chat box for questions to the panelists. Just use the Q&A box. Finally, this webinar will be recorded and shared on our Vimeo channel shortly after. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Carolyn Jean Martin, who is a writer, educator, and artist born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She attended the San Francisco Art Institute, where she received an MA in the history and theory of contemporary art and an MFA in painting. She's currently a PhD candidate at IDSVA or IDSVA. Her writing practice interrogates the impact of philosophy and aesthetic traditions on the construction of race and identity, with an emphasis on articulations of Blackness in the Western visual field. Academic interests include art and aesthetics of the African diaspora, global perspectives on modern and contemporary art, and visual culture intersections of modern and contemporary politics and aesthetics. Carolyn has presented her research at the University of Pretoria, UC Berkeley, San Francisco Art Institute, and the College Art Association Conference. Her art practice combines installation art, sculpture, and painting to create work that examines and challenges narratives of Americanness and contemporary culture in the United States. Her work has appeared in exhibitions in Guangzhou, China, Montreal, Canada, San Francisco, California, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Thank you, Carolyn, and the podium is yours.
Thank you so much, Simonetta, and thank you so much for everyone joining us today. I have much gratitude, of course, to you, Dr. Moro and Dr. Smith at IDSVA. And also, I too want to thank the University of Witwatersrand, University of Pretoria, and the Villa Lugodi Center of Sculpture at the Nirox Sculpture Park. Today, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Olu Oguibe, artist and research fellow at the University of Pretoria, and Dr. Johan Thom, artist and coordinator of fine art and postgraduate studies in fine art at University of Pretoria. They are both here today to explore the question of Africanness in relation to the expanded definition of sculpture. Olu Oguibe is an artist, author, curator, and a seminal figure in contemporary art, with outputs that include participation in international exhibitions, such as the Venice, Johannesburg, and Havana Biennials, Documenta and Castle, Sonsbeek, and numerous others. Additionally, curating major national and international exhibitions and projects, and publishing key art history and theory texts, such as the monograph Uzo Igonu, an African artist in the West in 1995, the seminal book of essays, The Culture Game in 2004, and the edited volume with Okwe Nwezor, Reading the Contemporary African Art from Theory to the Marketplace in 2000. I also want to introduce you to Johan Thom, a senior lecturer in fine art at the Department of Visual Art at the University of Pretoria. Thom works across a variety of media. His works have been included in group exhibitions at the Venice Biennale in 2003, the Canary Islands Biennale in 2006, and at the Palazzo della Dipesi in 2008, among many others. He has participated in conferences and workshops at the University of Pretoria, Documenta 13, the University of Cambridge, GradCam in Dublin, and the Finnish Academy of Fine Art, the Slade School of Fine Art, and the University of Beirut in Germany, among others. Please join me in a warm welcome for each of their presentations and a collective discussion that is to follow. Dr. Thom, you have the floor.
Part 1, Container, date 2010, mediums, sculptural intervention with turmeric, cow dung, soil, grass, and labor. Site, Maya Sarovar Public Park, Bodh Gaya, Bihar, India. Size, 5 meters by 1.2 meters approximately. For this artwork, Johan Thom, hereafter referred to only as the artist, creates an invisible public sculpture in a public park situated in Bodh Gaya, Bihar, India. In order to do so, the artist produces a large-scale, process-based sculptural intervention that organically disappears, leaving no physical traces of its existence. According to the artist's statement that accompanies the artwork on his website, the artist wants to draw attention to the momentary performative nature of the experience of art. Before we proceed, it is worth noting the following facts related to the art project for which the artist created work. The artist visited Bodh Gaya during the period of the 3rd to the 16th of February 2011. The visit formed part of an international art project, Buddha Enlightened, initiated by the artist Sanjeev Sinha from India and his life partner Diane Hagen, a Dutch artist. The project is officially funded and supported by the Government of India under patronage of His Excellency Mr. Anjani Kumar Singh, the Chief Secretary of the Province of Bihar. Now on the production of the artwork. The artist first spends 5 days exploring Maya Sarovar Public Park, interacting with its inhabitants. These inhabitants are mostly poor families and their children who also use the adjacent seasonal public dam for all their daily ablutions, including but not limited to cooking and washing. This group of people are thus designated as the public. Over a period of 5 working days, the artist now works with a number of local laborers to dig a hole approximately 5 meters in radius and 1.2 meters in depth. The hole forms the shape of a container or bowl in the earth. This shape is smoothed out and covered with a layer of locally sourced cow dung. Finally, a thick layer of turmeric, or haldi, is added. The bowl-shaped hole is left open for 2 days, after which point it is filled with soil and neatly covered with the original grass layer. The official representatives of the government of Bihar visits the site to look at the work on the evening of the 15th of February, the exhibition opening. They are deeply dismayed to find nothing worth seeing. A number of conceptual threads are woven into the work. India and South Africa are historically connected by way of the so-called spice route, first plotted during the 15th to the 17th century by European traders. The Cape of Good Hope was established as a resupply camp for the traders of the Dutch East India Company, who regularly traveled to Southeast Asia in search of spices. Haldi, or turmeric, is known in many parts of India as a particularly auspicious spice that is associated with marriage, thus signaling a co-joining of 2 different parts into a union. India is in fact home to one of the first great universities in the world, namely Nalanda University, 5th or 6th century CE to 1197 CE, a fact the artist often pondered while staying in the province of Bihar, where Nalanda was also located. Today, very few people know of this historical center of learning, and one might say it has all but disappeared from view. Finally, the artist Sanjeev Sinha unexpectedly passes away on the 6th of November 2020. Things appear and disappear. End part 1.
Part 2, screening of a section from Auto Portrait 2022 by Johan Thom, a 3-channel video on infinite loop. One of my most vivid memories of my mother is a photograph of her as a small child, somehow standing with both feet on my grandfather's outstretched left hand. Frozen in the moment, she appears as if precariously balanced between the forces of gravity and light, youth, hers, and old age, that of my grandfather, and finally, that of human care and joyful carelessness. For Auto Portrait, this photographic image serves as a prompt for more in-depth investigation into the poetics and mnemonics of death and loss. This is brought forward in the artwork through a performative interaction with a number of material objects. A human skull, the skin of a Livingston's Turaco bird that abruptly drops to the floor as I let it fall every 60 seconds. And finally, in the channel shown here, depicts a dress my mother loved, raised high above my head with a simple wooden contraption and taken for a walk through the streets where I live in Pretoria, South Africa. In it, the dress seems to float like a ghost, light and free, a sway in flashes of blue, pink, and green. Cinematographic credits, Gareth Fradgley and Alette Pretorius. I read from my diary, 24th of June, 2016. An entry. Mother, motherland. You have changed, but we are all the same. I am the same. We are visitors. Now, dense soft clouds patrol the borders between us, like fine grains of sand that burrow their way in between the gaps of your toes at the beach. A holiday. Sometime in the mid-80s, we were driving around KwaZulu-Natal, a red Toyota Corolla. Suddenly, we are surrounded by people, a horde, a host, a volatile, angry crowd. Some are carrying pangas, others carry guns, sticks, stones, and some shot. This must be a protest of sorts, but I am too young to understand. I know my father has his gun. It's hidden in the cubbyhole. How many people? How many shots? My mother turns around and she says, stay calm. Second entry, 2019. An image, a scan, an MRI, white spots, little clouds in the night, or stars on a cloudless night. Too many to count. What do they mean? We don't know. We don't know exactly what these things are, but certainly they show signs of growth. This could account for loss of memory. No, it does not represent a negative prognosis. We simply don't understand what it means. On Saturday, I will go home. I will go back to my country. I will be back inside the spotted skull of my motherland. End part 2. All bodies have weight. And volume. Space. take the example of microscopic, seeing atoms or other entities with the aid of a microscope is not a matter of simply looking, of passively gazing on something as a spectator, but an achievement. That requires a complex set of practices to accomplish. To see, one must actively intervene. You learn to see through a microscope by doing it, and not simply by looking. Experimenting and theorizing are dynamic activities. They are practices that play a constitutive role in the production of objects, and subjects, and matter, and meaning. Flesh, raw and formless, bodily materiality, the mythical, primary material, building block. Through corporeal inscriptions, written, juridical, medical, human discipline, it's constituted as a distinctive body capable of acting in distinctive ways, performing specific tasks in socially specified ways, marked, branded by a social seal. Bodies become emblems, heralds, badges, theatres, tableau of social laws and rights, illustrations and exemplifications of law, informing and rendering pliable flesh into determinate bodies, producing the flesh as a point of departure and a locus of incision. And finally, this time that is disappearing, this passing time, it meant abandoning conventional views. This time is not a series, but an interlocking of presents, past and future, that retain their gains of other presents, of other pasts and futures, each age bearing, altering, and maintaining the previous ones. We follow a great variety of temporal trajectories and a wide range of swings, only reducible to an analysis in terms of convergent or divergent evolution at the extraordinary cost of the impoverishment of our reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that, Johan. That was absolutely incredible. Olu, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all the folks who've joined us today. I'm an old-fashioned believer that Saturdays are for families, or at least doing yard work, visiting museums and the small farmers market. So thank you for taking the time out. A lot of thanks to the organizers of the event, was directly from me to Johan and his colleagues who've been working on these series for a while, and to all the different institutions that are involved. What else I would like to do is give some general remarks about the topic of our discussion, and then, time permitting, talk about a recent work, more or less recent, that might in some ways speak to or demonstrate some of the points or issues pertinent to the subject matter. At this point, I should make a small confession. And my confession is that our topic today, namely the question of Africanness and the expanded field of sculpture, is somewhat peculiar to me. The peculiar aspect is not the bit about the expanded field of sculpture, but rather the question of Africanness. I have to confess that the question of Africanness is not one that I'm too enthusiastic about, or one that I entertain too often. And I should call to mind that nearly 30 years ago, I published a quite contentious paper at the time called In the Heart of Darkness, in which I contested the very notion of Africanness itself, or at least the received notion of Africanness up to that moment. Until then, the prevailing notion of Africa and Africanness, especially in the West, but also elsewhere outside the continent, as far as art and art practice is concerned, had been exclusively sub-Saharan Black. That seemed incongruous to me for several reasons. The first being that the ancient town or city from which the continent takes its name was not sub-Saharan. It was the Berber city or kingdom of Africa in present-day Tunisia that the continent was subsequently named after, with the sub-Saharan part still mostly referred to wholly as Ethiopia until well into the 18th century. In broad historical time, that's rather quite recent. And I should add that the nation, the modern nation of Ethiopia did not exist until very recently. So the whole sub-Saharan part of Africa was known in Europe as Ethiopia. And that's part of the reason why many African Americans make a claim to have come from Ethiopia. That's the old Ethiopia, the Ethiopia that represented the whole of sub-Saharan Africa, rather than the nation on the Horn of Africa, which is now known as Ethiopia. That was Abyssinia back then. Now, while today this might seem one quibble too many, my second reservation was that the continent still is a vast terrain of almost innumerable groups and cultures and languages of no less vastly disparate migratory histories and delineations. So the then prevailing notion of an almost homogeneous Africanness, literally marked with a line in the sand at the bottom of the Sahara, struck me as rather simplistic. That was nearly 30 years ago. But I believe my questioning of that notion did occasion a significant revision in the way it would subsequently be applied to at least narratives and critiques of contemporary art from the continent. About a decade after In the Heart of Darkness was published, I had a rather interesting experience which brought up once more the question of Africanness. This time it was, in fact, in relation to what we're referring to in this discussion as the expanded field of sculpture. In 2005, I was invited along with several contemporary artists from different parts of the globe to make new public work for an urban regeneration project in Korea. The Korean project director was a friend and colleague with whom I'd participated in previous other international projects. So I traveled to Korea and with the project director, visited several sites in Anyang Valley, where the project was sited. The old resort town of Anyang is located between Mount Anyak and Mount Samsung outside Seoul, the capital city. And Mount Samsung is the mountain from which the giant electronics company takes its name. After the visit, when I returned to Connecticut, I spent a great many long nights in the studio, hashing out ideas for a public sculpture, which I then sent to the director. He had already accepted my initial idea, which was to make a work that would acknowledge a small group of ancient Buddhist monks, known in Korean mythology as the three monks of great virtue, who once had a monastery not far from the site. My work would take the form of an altar comprised of a seat placed on a large boulder we found on the site. This was pretty much in line with my practice of situating public work historically within its site, rather than shopping the same idea around, or to quote Trenton Minher's seminal essay on the subject, from one place to another. To reflect that this work was a gift from my culture to the site in honor of the monks, I gave it the name, the Igbo name for altar or shrine. So now it came down to what form this altar would take. And my idea was decidedly modernist as far as the seat was concerned, and very minimalist, because in architecture and furniture, those are my preferences. However, when I sent the idea sketches to my friend, his response was quite brief. "We would like something African," he said. Now that took me aback. What did he mean by something African? I'd innocently presumed, or rather taken for granted, that today in the 21st century, anything I make as an African is inherently and invariably African as well. But not so my colleague. He determinedly wished for a form or object which is easily and clearly visually distinguishable as African in reference and origin. Authorship alone, or even along with concept, was not enough. The form had to be identifiably African. But how? In discussion, it soon became quite evident that this was not an argument I could win if I wanted the project to succeed. I had made other major public work in Asia, where the question of Africanness did not arise and was not an issue. This time, however, I felt like I could almost understand why in a large field of artists that was in fact bound to increase over the years as the project expanded, my friend wished for a certain variety in approach and languages among the works that might reflect different cultures from different geographies. So a somewhat predictable or easily recognizable Africanness seemed in order to expect, which in itself did not address what this Africanness might entail or visually resemble. In the end, given the importance of the concept in both our views, I chose to drop the idea of a modernist sculpture and instead interpret the seat for the altar in easily identifiable form by modeling it on an Igbo stool, which we then had cut in crystal in Korea and had it back to the separate bag of mirror finished stainless steel. I was still trying to work in some, if you like, modernism and melamanism with the stainless steel mirror. And it wasn't entirely clear to me that the new form would translate Africanness itself any more than my participation showed. But it did satisfy the desire or wish. And we made what, in my thinking, was a successful work. I'll give you a very quick view of the work itself, and then continue with the rest of my discussion. So here is one of the one image of the final result of this Give Us Something African encounter. This is called Okumo, which is Igbo for a shrine or altar. And it's modeled on, it's actually modeled on an Igbo stool, traditional stool, which is somewhat enlarged. And let's see if I can find the image. Yeah, here we go. And what else do we have? Well, there we have that particular work. And I should proceed. We'll come back to it later. So now, what all this implies to me is that there inevitably has to be several different ways of interpreting or demonstrating Africanness, one of which is to offer references, like I did in that work, to or reinventions of traditional or pre-colonial forms from the continent. But that's only one way of seeing. There's a more important understanding of the defining place of Africanness in the expanded field of sculpture, one which it could be argued may or may not have been apparent to my colleague at that time. And that is the fact that almost all modern and contemporary sculpture bear an element of Africanness, irrespective of where they're made or who by. I say almost all because there are extant traditions and tendencies in modern and contemporary sculpture that may have parallels in traditions of form in Africa, but do not owe to those traditions or influences directly or indirectly. So one has to acknowledge that because it's a huge world. Most, however, owe directly along quite brief lineages to traditions of form that entered global modern art and creative practices round about the turn of the 20th century. And in many respects, this is ground that's been plowed over once too many times, and not always for the right reasons. The salient points, however, can be easily summarized. The encounter between African art and European art, especially at the end of the 19th and the turn of the 20th centuries, stripped European art of its pretentious and often misinformed allusions to classical Greek and Roman art, especially in sculpture. And while leading European artists directly model their new forms after objects and traditions from Africa, the most significant change was that those objects and traditions from Africa liberated European and eventually all modern and contemporary artists globally and gave them license, as it were, to think of art and form and color and concept in entirely new ways and without inhibition or limitations on the imagination. Looking at objects and art traditions from Africa and realizing that a sculptor did not have to hew stone like Michelangelo did, or like Phidias was mistakenly supposed to have done, or create formulaic bronze figures, groups narrating or approximating romanticist neoclassical allegories along stiflingly narrow and often repetitive parameters, but instead could break out and reimagine form and discard singular perspective and use or incorporate hitherto decidedly non-sculptural materials, going by European academic standards, of course, and create assemblage and collage or animated situations once consigned to puppetry or the circus, and recombine these with dance and theater, just like West or Central Africans do, and bring it all under the rubric of art with or without delineations. This realization also encouraged artists to then go back to other traditions within their own cultures that they were otherwise wont to ignore in favor of the Western academic tradition, and rediscover and study and try to reclaim those other traditions and reinsert them in extant and modern and contemporary practices. That, I think, is the ultimate element of Africanness in the expanded field of sculpture. And that freedom, that liberty to stretch the definitions of sculpture and the sculptural traditions beyond ideas of making or imaging that had existed for centuries in Europe, and produce integrated, multivalent new creations that draw on not just form and space, but multiple realms of existence and experience and impact on all the senses. And that element of limitless possibility, that African element of infinite daring, which you see in the sculptures and you see in the masquerades and you see in the dances and you see in the theatrical performances, that liberty, that sense of infinite possibility, the daring and the jest and the subterfuge and implausible inventiveness, that is still what most contemporary art still rides on, be it sculpture in all its expanded dimensions, or performance art, or new forms of painting, or digital imaging, all the way down to NFTs today. The very idea that an electronically resident algorithm could be art, that's African. And this Africanness defined modern art as it still defines global contemporary art on and from every continent. I would argue that this is the more important element of Africanness, which is evident in my own practice, especially because I decided or chose quite early in my career, or perhaps it was chosen for me by a natural rebellious temperament, to make work which is not predictable, particularly with regard to form. My work would, in essence, explore the full freedom that sculptors and artists in old African societies demonstrated in their eclectic and uninhibited choices, letting theme and purpose and occasion determine my methods rather than stick to a formula or a work that restricts itself within any definitions. I think this aesthetic freedom may be seen in some of the recent and still ongoing projects that I've been working on. And I think we just saw that in Johan's presentation. We see it all around in contemporary art. You go back to the 14th century, the 15th century, right up to the 19th century, and that would not be, hardly any of that would be accepted within the definitions of sculpture in the Western tradition. But today, that's what we do, and we keep pushing the envelope, and we keep pushing the limits, because African art gave modern and contemporary art the license to do so. At this point, I would actually like to try and bring up some images of this particular work and round out with some discussion of the work itself. I'm making another attempt to do this electronic thing of sharing screens, which I'm not very comfortable with. But this is work which began in 2018 when Johan and Benji, who is the founder of NIROX Foundation and Artist Residency, convinced me to go and do a residency there. And I wanted to do something that, again, is specific to South Africa. And there was no shortage of ideas and subject matter. However, I chose to make some work at NIROS itself while being there, but the more important project that really brought me to NIROS and to South Africa with Johan's help was to address a very contentious issue in South Africa, and one which eventually took form, controversial form, in the figure of a young woman named Nokuphila Khumalo, who was murdered in 2013 and who happened to be a sex worker. I should try and see if I can show some images of Nokuphila. So here we are. So some of you might be familiar with the story of this young woman whose photograph actually does not exist, we're told. Her mother did tell us eventually that there are no surviving photographs of her. Nokuphila Khumalo was a sex worker in Cape Town. And as some of you might remember, she was murdered by someone who allegedly turned out to be a very prominent South African artist, someone that I actually knew quite well, and someone whose career in some way many of us had contributed to promote because he was a fantastic artist. But it did turn out also that he was much more than the artist that we all used to love at some point and all supported. Now, Nokuphila was brutally kicked to death on the sidewalk on an early morning in, I believe, April 2013. And I wanted to address that. I wanted to do something, make something that centers around her, but uses that to address not just the question of sex work itself, but also the subject of sexual violence in South Africa, in Africa, wherever else it still occurs, and it does at an astronomical level. So the idea that we chose was to, let's see, what I decided to do was to take off from an interview that Nokpila's mother gave after she died, when she explained that she had no photographs. The one thing that she remembered, and I've told this story so many times, one thing that she remembered was that she loved pink and white flowers. And so I wanted to make a public memorial of sorts using pink and white flowers. And we sort of kicked around several ideas how to realize this public memorial with pink and white flowers. And finally, I settled on the idea of using live plants, live flowers. And the other side of the idea is that we would create this public memorial. But because these were live plants, which we couldn't just leave there, I didn't want to leave them there. I didn't want to make them permanent in any site at any rate, because then that becomes itself a burden because it has to be taken care of. What I decided was that we would encourage visitors to take these plants home with them and, you know, take care of them, plant them in their gardens or keep them in their kitchens or whatever, and care for them. And insofar as they do that, to remember this young woman and remember her story and remember how she came to her violent and abrupt death at such a young age, and perhaps use that also, who knows, in their home as a teaching tool. You know, it's something that someone could use to explain to their children why this plant is in the home or how they got it, and use that to tell the story of this young woman. I know that I've been going for quite a while. I should round up very quickly. So at any rate, we used about 4,400 or 500, I don't remember now, plants to create this situation. And that is, that's Luca there, I think, Johan's son. This was realized at the University of the Northwest in Potchefstroom. And eventually people did take the plants. People did take the plants home. I think I've probably moved too far. Yeah, so these are some of the visitors taking the plants with them, which I thought was a good way to realize what I had in mind. However, I did not want this to be the end of the project itself. I wanted it to be a living project that could be revisited again and again in different forms. And the next opportunity to do so came in 2020. And this came in the form, where is that? Okay. So this came in the form of an invitation to participate in Sansbeek, which is a public work festival in the Netherlands. The project director this time was Dr. Bonaventure Ndikun. And I thought that for Sansbeek, what I might do is to recreate the monument in South Africa on a much larger scale, given the nature of the International Sculpture and Art Festival, but sticking to that pink and white flowers So that's why, we have this. This is my initial proposal. As happens with many of these things, and you have to be flexible, it turned out we could not realize that initial proposal for an interesting reason. And the reason was because I wanted to use tulips to make the flowers, live tulips. I wanted us to plant a whole field of tulips in pink and white varieties and so on. But I was told after much consultation that given the time that we had, and because of climate change, we could not predict how the flowers would turn out. They might not turn out pink, they might have bloom, they might bloom at a different time than when we needed them to do so. It was made clear to me that we could not, if we wanted to meet the deadline, we could not proceed with that idea. And that's how eventually I decided to do that work differently. And the result was that we took the path of more or less traditional public sculpture. So this is in Sunsbeek Park in the Netherlands. And we made these neon sculpture forms in a way using neon also to sort of reference sex work to a certain degree. And a second version of this was in the center of town. So this is the work at night, and this is in the center of town at night as well. This is the second part of it. And finally, this work is ongoing. It's already returning to South Africa in November in a number of different forms. It's returning to South Africa as a work on paper, but also as a smaller sculpture, we hope. And we also, myself and Johan, and a number of facilitators and collaborators, we hope to bring this back to South Africa next year, which would be the 10th anniversary of Nokuphela's death, and perhaps convene a symposium, international conference or gathering or symposium or seminars to address the issue of sexual violence, as well as the challenges of sex work in the South African society. So I'll probably round up there. And I think the point of this whole presentation, mine or Johan's, is really to point out that what African art or Africanness brought to our practices, to modern and contemporary practice, is that license to explore beyond stone sculpture or bronze sculpture or white alabaster, and explode the very idea of what is sculpture, make it live, flowers, make it, spices, whatever needs to be used to convey a certain idea in sculptural form. That idea of the sculptural being completely blown apart. That's the Africanness in modern and contemporary practice. And I think that's the Africanness in my own practice that I actually stick to, rather than the, predictable ideas of what Africanness is. So thank you. And I hope that we get some questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Olu and Johan, for these wonderful presentations that you've given us today. I'm certainly overwhelmed and struck by the art that you showed us. And in particularly, I think there's this kind of synergy that, for me, that I see. I was struck by, the lack of images of Nokuphela. And the way in which, Olu, you used flowers, and the way that people could take the plant away, give it care, and remember and share the story, creating this kind of dynamic sense of story. And then Johan, also the dress of your mother that moves through that space, recalling memories, you know. And I think also part of the auto portrait work that you showed us also involves that tucaro bird, which also this idea of an object moving through space. And in conjunction with seeing that work, what is still certainly on my mind was the last 2 weeks of spectacle that we saw with the death of Queen Elizabeth, right? The objects that moved through the United Kingdom, the casket, the orb, the scepter, moving through the streets, and you know, and the way that the visual is used to, in that sense, to maintain empire, create empire, right? And in terms of this discussion today, I think about that kind of, how objects are used in that way. And I think for both of you, you have this beautiful ability to harness the energy of how the object can remind someone of historical narratives, and reinforce how, you know, the object can reinforce ideologies, how we have these kind of perceptions of one, but also the other, and how we engage these personal constructions of memory through an object. I'd love you both to speak a bit more about of the trajectory of your work, expanding on this kind of intentionality that happens with the shifting geographies of the body, the imprint the body leaves on a place, and conversely, the imprint of a place on the body within sculpture or performance. You know, and in particular, I think this trajectory of your work in this regard, about geographies of bodies and memory.
Olu, I wonder if you would permit me to say some words first. So because of the nature of my presentation, it's obviously not a straightforward presentation, but because of that nature, I mean, I didn't get to say thanks to everyone. So I should like to say thank you very much to everyone, you know, everyone who organized the talk, to Sven who presented a part of my talk for me. You know, and then in particular, I should also like to say thank you to Olu, but let me explain that, and then by way of some answer to your question. So as a young student, an undergrad student, I always challenge things, but I think what I found for myself was that at the time when I was an undergrad student here, we weren't really studying African art. What counted as African art certainly weren't contemporary African artworks. Where we did those works, they might have concerned the Khoisan's artistic practice, for example, you know, and then we had things like classical African art, you know, but they really didn't form the core of your syllabi. So by the time that I started doing my master's degree, and I was working from a university slapdash in the middle of the city, which you know, was a completely demographic from my previous university where I'd studied, I felt this incredible need to connect better with my place of living. And one of those connections, of course, has to do with a simple realization that as a young white Afrikaans boy, you are suddenly surrounded by urban city dwellers, most of whom have slightly darker skins than yourself, and speak other languages. And so there was a real need on my part to say, well, how is it that I fit into this world? This is the bigger world. It's not that kind of quiet world of domestic space that is familiar in some way. So I then decided, well, now I have to re-educate myself. And I went off to the libraries and I took out every book on African art that I could find, every book on African philosophy I could find. At the time, also finding that most of those books had only been checked out once or twice. And it was during this process that a number of friends of mine, strangely, one American curator at the African Museum, or the Museum for African Art, New York at the time, ended up sending me a lot of books about African art. So
from
here
New
I'm sitting in
York.
South Africa. Yes, I mean, you know what I'm saying. Okay, so now these books land here in large packages because I suddenly start teaching African art. And I read these books being published from New York. Some of the authors are still very much current today and so on anything from classical art to so-called modernist African art. And along the way, then, of course, you know, I start to think I receive all the books about rituals and all of those things. But it's that fantastic encounter suddenly with a performative that says to me, hey, you know, I don't have to produce work that just easily sits inside the gallery. I don't have to think about the confines. And so it links very nicely to what Olu is saying. And I'll never forget, I mean, there's Anthony Appiah, or I think maybe in the US you say Appiah, but I'll never forget what in one of the books, his preface starts with, the idea of Africa is largely invented by Europeans, you know, and that always stopped me right in my tracks. And so kind of dispelled this idea for me neatly to begin with, although I saw the currency of it sitting around. But I kept hammering away at looking at what counted not necessarily as African art, but rather just as cultural practices. And that opened up the world for me on a very broad level. So suddenly I understood ritual, its kind of seminal space within African cultures, but also I think more specifically about how the object itself didn't function as an isolated singular object. It operated more as a kind of a functional symbolic object within a ritualized performative space. It had a function. It wasn't purely aesthetic, for example, you know. And then sort of as this journey progresses, I finally one day end up receiving a book by a certain professor who's on this panel, by Olu. Someone else sent it to me as well, called The Culture Game. And in that, there's an essay, there's a number of essays, but one of the kind of touchstones for me was again that question of Africanness and how it played out in the work of Yinka Shonibari. And specifically through the kind of double Dutch work, you know, which was kind of essential work. So at that point, I think there's a number of things that click for me in my own head, one of which is this fantastic conceptual daring do that you could combine with usage of materials that somehow signify belonging, no matter how complicated they are. And that then sets me on a path of really kind of freeing myself up from a largely Eurocentric art education. And suddenly it has me thinking about how things are dynamic in different ways. Mm-hmm. But it makes me acutely aware of the power structures that play out in the art world. And I take these things forward finally with a kind of a focus on the body as a dynamic thing, on the nature of found objects, these hats. I mean, this hat is from New York, but they sold here in Pretoria. And they sold here for a specific group of people, Black South Africans, who purchased them for wedding gifts. So you get this hat with a trench coat, a pair of shoes, and a bottle of whiskey when you go and propose, and you meet your father-in-law and so on. And so suddenly all these objects are pregnant with meaning in ways that I'd never quite considered before. But I also understand that these objects are pregnant with meaning, and as such, they require activation. And that suddenly breaks that kind of isolated notion of the artwork as sitting on a pedestal being quiet. So there's a long story there, and I would like to hand over to Olu now.
Quite frankly, I think you've addressed it all. And the idea of the hat and its story speaks directly to Carolyn's question regarding the body, how objects of clothing, of course, not even just symbolically, but also biologically, actually do preserve the body that's been in them. You know, that's why I'm usually quite skeptical about used clothing, you know, because that's an incrustation of a body, and perhaps buddies, their cat, their family, their friends, the places they visit, and so on and so forth, all physically, microscopically imbued and embodied in that object. And it's the same, of course, on a more metaphorical level with just about every other object. And I think that became apparent to modern artists, that this is what's going on here, and this is what we've been missing in our, well, academic traditions. Because quite frankly, the other thing to point out, and you would notice this when you go to, say, Germany, or to Ireland and other places, if you go to Bavaria and so on. In all honesty, the traditions that we're referring to in Africa, you actually find them in Europe. It's just that they were ignored in preference to an academic invention. This is one of the, actually, when I began to understudy Ella Natsui, not just as his student, but also as a budding critic, someone who was interested in writing about his work and other people's works. He always talked about a performance he did in northern Germany. And he had discovered this bowl, I think some kind of a wooden bowl or so, that the people there used to invoke rain. It's like a rain-making kind of bowl. They would bring it out at some point if there's drought or whatever, and they would do certain performance. This is in northern Germany. This isn't in West Africa or Central Africa. So it's this idea that had been stripped from the academic tradition, this idea that all things, and I don't mean this in a particularly metaphysical way, because I'm not very metaphysical myself, but all things embody other things. Every object has stories around it, has people who've touched it, have its uses, and all these can be activated, as you said, Johan, in a different space. You see, so that the kettle, which is traditionally active in the kitchen, can be reactivated in an artistic and creative space, where it then speaks to perhaps cooking, perhaps the people who've used it, perhaps so many other things that sort of enlarge its ramifications and all the things that it invokes. So personally, I didn't have to learn this in school. And I was actually thinking about this when I was preparing my presentation, that I wrote about this at the very beginning of my career in what you might call a manifesto that I published in 1989. It was called "My Feet Have Found the Path." And it went into how my training, my academic training, was in many ways very European, although I was studying under people like Ella Natsui, Bureau Dejuku, and so on. In many respects, we still had to do life drawing and so on, all those things, and we had to use charcoal and oil paints. Imagine oil paints in Nigeria. I mean, we had to get them from Europe. We had to wait on friends who went to Europe to pick oranges and apples during the holidays to bring back oil paints, because they don't make them in Nigeria and they don't exist. So why were we making work with oil paints? This is what I addressed in "My Feet Have Found a Path," just to say, now I realize that my mother and all the other women painting the mud walls, that's painting. They're making murals, right? I had almost been moved away from understanding that is art. I had to get back to it. and think of all the other things that growing up rural, it's still a very traditional Igbo society. All the things that I learned, my father making mask faces for, these masking societies, while at the same time being a preacher of the Church of Christ and making other images for Catholics. He also made images of St. Mary and so on for the Catholics. So he was, he sort of dipped in every bowl that he could find, which is relevant to what we're doing, because the eclecticism in Johan's work or my work sort of also derives from that kind of awareness that it's what you make out of it because of your sensibility and sensitivity to what things actually represent, that you don't always have to create new things in order to evoke these sentiments and emotions and narratives and histories and memories. They're already there if you know where to look.
It is, and I think that in hearing you talk about, both of you talk about the response to that question, but also this idea of freedom and infinite possibilities that is within these expanded, definitions that we have of sculpture, and this idea of Africanness is woven through almost all art production, which I absolutely agree with. And then this education that one goes through to arrive at that place. It makes me think, I think it was Sylvia Wynter that says, we are disciplined into thinking along lines that reinscribe our annihilation, and we have to become undisciplined. And I think in becoming undisciplined, we have to, think about the idea of Africa and Africanness in these much larger, dynamic, global ways, and certainly the ways, Olu, that you put forth in The Heart of Darkness and the Culture Game and the Double Dutch, the other essays you've done. It makes me think of Thelwyn Sarr, philosopher, economist, musician. He was thinking and speaking about this idea that Africa places this idea of is the future, will be the future, and within claims like that, it implicitly implies that the idea of Africa's co-presence with the present is not there. It rings hollow. And so I think it is this idea of Africa in this ongoing perpetual future creates this idea of Africa and Africanness as an object itself, right? And it is that idea of the object and the way in which the Western world thinks about Africa, and they don't think about it in this kind of global dynamic way and the way that cultural production is happening. And I think both of you, capture that kind of global dynamics and that internal place of sense that we call home, within those kind of working through those Western signifiers of what is African, right? You both provoke viewers to recognize the reality of immigration, migration, and importantly, this idea of not just focusing on African diaspora in the world, but the idea of the diaspora within any given place. So I thank you so much for the work that you all have certainly done with that. And I think that before I get to the audience questions, I just want to kind of, I'm intrigued to ask, Olu, you started as a painter and you've moved into these, thinking of, for lack of a better term, this idea of social sculpture and the engagement of bodies around a fixed object, around that sign, sex work, dishonest work, or of course, the monument for strangers and refugees. Johan, that brick that gave me tension and stress as it moved around you. I want to just ask you, how did you get to this place of determining, moving away from perhaps fixed objects into this space of thinking about sculpture in this more dynamic way, and how bodies interact with it and how you interact with it as well?
In my case, it's actually quite easy. And I think about this all the time. I actually thought about it yesterday or day before yesterday, how having trained formally as a painter, I'm making my reputation almost as a sculptor or installation artist, not just as a painter. I haven't given up painting by any stretch of the imagination. But the earliest things that I made as a child were sculptures, because my father was making them. And like I said, yesterday I thought about it. I actually thought about this with a certain sense of sadness, because the earliest things I made, I used Melina bark. Melina is a tree that was introduced in some parts of West Africa because people use the wood. It's white timber. So it lines the streets, even in the village and so on. And it has a thick bark. So I would bark it and use the bark. I'm talking about 6 years old, 7 years old, and use the bark to make small, what would, I think now we would refer to as passport masks, right? Small masks, without the eyes, real figures, faces, from which I progressed to actually making small busts. And I'm still 8 years old and so on, because my father is making these things and I'm understudying him. But it's also painting signs. So I'm also learning about paint. At the same time, art wasn't something that I wanted to, well, for one, I had no sense of professions as a child. But as I became a little older, into my teens and so on, it wasn't art that I wanted to do. I had other ideas. And that's where the social part of it comes in, because what I actually most wanted to do was a journalist. And my sense of journalism was sparked by having a correspondence relationship with a man who had been a journalist and was jailed as a journalist, perhaps when I wasn't even born. I met this guy. We went to a school excursion to a coal mine, and he happened to be in the information officer there. And he told the story of his trajectory and career, and how he went to prison as an investigative or that kind of journalist. Now I wanted to do that, but when I eventually did not do that and did art instead, I think some of that came into it as well. In addition to what Johan already pointed out, that in the kind of society where I grew up, growing up rural, not an urban environment. In the rural society that I grew up in, of course, art was still is a social vehicle. You use it for those purposes. So it all came together into manifesting as sculptural installations or performance and so on and so forth. But it's really all together, because the monuments I'm making are pretty much graphics today. I mean, it's all about typography and so on. So there's no static space that I wish to occupy or do occupy. We just have to straddle all available spaces and all available languages in all available cultures, because my work has also drawn from, and I take this not just for myself, or from L and the people that I studied with, but Picasso and Brancusi and so on. I take from wherever. It's still my work. It's still the point that I want to make, and so yeah, I think that's the short version of it. The long version of it is coming in the future, right? Published by, I don't know, Kruger Press or somebody.
I wonder if I can just say two short things quickly. The first concerns the nature of time, temporality, and the kind of encounter with Africa by Europe, and the nature in which that encounter is complicated by a rather narrow-minded view of time, of history itself, immeasurably complicated by it. And one of the books I read while I was kind of dodging that brick was on the post-colony, where I specifically mentioned the question of time and how temporality itself, or how multitude temporality seem to coexist within Africa at the moment, but actually within the world. It's just that in that encounter with Africa, initially there's a very set notion of what time this is. It's dark Africa, it's backward Africa. But then as slowly as that encounter deepens, there's a realization of these numerous temporalities that now seem to coexist simultaneously. And then rather than accept that as a state, if you like, of the world, the word chaos is typically used when we discuss Africa. The word, the kind of terms that are utilized to describe Africa are negative in origin and so on, rather than kind of attending to the dynamic things that do happen. The fact that that this is in actual fact a good foundation for the world to start from, that we say these multiple temporalities are part and parcel of life. This is how it is. And I think for me that is something that I take with in the world. But I also just want to talk about this thing, because the question of Africanness and whether it should, or where it finds its roots and so on. One of the things is, at the very least, when I depart from this space and I go elsewhere, I always go with a rather open mind, in the sense that I find that I am open to experiences around me. And I think, the old term was something like a citizen of the world. And I think that most good contemporary artists try and be citizens of the world. They do not try and lock themselves into their own particular cultural traditions for whatever gains there might be. I think, this is a dynamic thing. Cultural, whether you're a musician or so, or any kind of cultural practitioner, we steal from each other continuously, or the word is appropriate, I suppose, which is the much nicer term for it. But we do this. We cannot.
Actually, it's a word that I don't approve of. I don't. And I wrote about this also. I wrote an essay called God's Transistor Radio, where I addressed that the culture doesn't appropriate. Culture, the very nature of culture is that it absorbs, right?
Exactly.
It's
exactly.
It just, and it has no rules. It doesn't listen to anybody. Children are going to wear what they're going to wear because they see other children wearing it, and they're not going to ask your permission, right? They're not going to ask where it's coming from. Musicians are going to do that. So culture has a dynamism of its own. It's a speed train on it doesn't have a driver. It just does its thing, whether you like it or not. And in France, they're fighting English. But it's not a battle you can win, because language doesn't respect that. It just takes from wherever. Culture it's not appropriation, but I can understand the introduction of that term, but I think it's also a term that is very much abused by people who don't really understand the dynamics of culture.
I think what it does is it fundamentally position some kind of dishonesty in that dynamics. Now that dishonesty perhaps has its place when you're looking at straightforward cultural imperialism. Sure,
yeah.
But cultural imperialism is very rarely interested in taking something from its so-called subjects, you know. That I think is the very definition of imperialism. All it wants is it wants to take resources, but it's certainly not interested in adopting or taking from. It can't necessarily stop that process from happening because, as you say rightly, Ola, culture is dynamic. So something will slip in on the side, and you will bring those kind of other cultural signifiers with you. You simply can't stop that from happening. I mean, we had apartheid in this country, and they tried everything here to stop the races from intermingling. They tried every last thing, unsuccessfully. That is it. So we simply can't stop certain things from happening, no matter how strongly we may oppose them.
People are going to take out Chinese, whether you like it or not. You know, they might insist on their Britishness, but they'll still, you know, and hate the Chinese and so on. But they'll still take out, you know, Chinese food. So, yeah, that's the nature of culture.
We have many questions. I certainly have a lot of questions myself, but I'm going to go to questions from our many viewers out here. The first one I have comes from Novel Scholars, and they say, thank you for this wonderful exploration. My question is for Dr. Oguibe. Her question is for Dr. Oguibe, and it's with regard to the origin with reference to Africanness. Are you explicitly saying that origin is pre-colonial and therefore Black? And is it this Blackness in actuality that influenced modernity or the definitions of contemporary art as it relates to freedom?
What was the word again? Origin?
Yeah, the word with regard to origin in reference to Africanness. Are you saying that origin is pre-colonial and therefore Black? And is this Blackness in actuality that influenced modernity or the definitions of contemporary art as it relates to freedom, and how you were speaking about the kind of infinite possibilities that comes with contemporary art?
Yeah, Blackness doesn't even come into it. That's actually one word that I did not make much reference to, having pointed out that I went into the subject of Africanness back in the early 90s because there was a misinterpretation of Africanness. There was a staid and received ethnographic understanding of Africa, which thought about it as sub-Saharan only, when in fact the continent itself is named from, you know, after a town in Tunisia. So the idea of sub-Saharan Blackness as synonymous with Africanness, that's where I actually started out part of my public intellectual life, contesting that and pointing out that that did not make sense. I'm pointing out that Africa is a vast continent of different cultures and languages and so on, you know, including white people who've been there for 400 years, you know, and Asians and Arabs and so on and so forth, and Black Africans who don't understand each other, who are just as diverse from one another as these other groups are from people who have darker skin. So no, I've never actually accepted the idea of Africanness or Africanity as being exclusively Black. But as far as modern and contemporary art is concerned, you know, the reason I said it's a much plowed over topic that probably doesn't deserve to be returned to is that the facts are just very plain, you know, that it was work from Africa, and that's what I used. I did not say Black work or sub-Saharan work, or work from Africa. You can then try to trace where in Africa and which cultures in Africa, but it's work from Africa that European artists encountered and engaged with, and especially Paris, that transformed all modern and contemporary practice. It's you can there's been exhibitions even at the Metropolitan Museum showing side by side, you know, here is the African sculpture and here is Brancusi's work. Here is the African sculpture and here is Picasso's work, showing exactly, directly how they not only were influenced by it, but in many instances copied the work, you know. So we didn't spend time on that. It's not blackness that influenced them. It's a different understanding of form, a different understanding of the creative imagination, one that you know, we might say in our modern terms seemed, and seemed is important, seemed entirely uninhibited. I have a book here, for instance. I have this book here, and you can find in this single sculpture entire traditions of modern and contemporary art, from people wrapping the, you know, people who made careers wrapping things, you know, the sculptors and the artists whose careers began with this part.
Yeah.
Before they were able to wrap bridges and wrap buildings and wrap all the other things that they wrapped, they began with this section of this particular sculpture, this sculpture here. Right. Not their imagination or their creativity or anything, this very work. And you can see it in people who've won the Golden Lion recently at the Venice Biennial. This sculpture, that's what I'm talking about. This isn't blackness. But more importantly for me is that it's this kind of work where you find paper, you find rope, you find that, you find the paint. There was no paint on Western sculpture by the 19th century. It all been stripped. The only color that you found in the accepted academic sculpture was aging bronze. Everything else was stripped and bare. Color was taken out of it. But people saw that, you know, and they saw that, and this and that do not match. And they saw ropes, and they saw paper, and they saw this thing here. And they were like, why are we making this boring stuff when we could do that? That's the license that I'm talking about. And that's the license that drives all modern and contemporary art. It doesn't matter who you are making art today. It's the license that came from this kind of work that drives what you're doing, even if you're making just watercolors. That's the fact. Yeah. And it isn't about blackness. Yeah, I hope indeed. That addresses the question.
Yeah. I also have a question directly for Johan. It was interesting in it because this viewer, Shana Gar, they say, I was interested to hear about viewer reception to container, particularly the town officials who miss seeing the turmeric beneath the surface. Were there, or could you please expand upon interactions as a part of the art with the public who routinely visit the park for ablutions?
Sure. I hope I'm unmuted. Yes. Okay. So you know, firstly, as Sven explained in his reading of that text in the third person, the first thing that happened is I visited the park and I walked around and I saw who is actually using this space. Who is this space for? So there's a dam in that space, but that's used for tourists, and it's really poor fare anyway. Very few tourists visit it. So really what that so-called touristy dam, concrete dam, if you can imagine such a thing, but what it really does is it services the local community, and it really gives them a place to wash, to do their cooking, to go to the loo. I mean, it's a disaster on that level, but this is how it is. One area of the dam is used for that, another area is used for something else. And then daily for kids to come and play there and so on. So I very quickly picked up that this is what the function of that space is. The park itself is not really active, not that area of the park, at least where where they gave me a site to work with. It's a very beautiful open grass area, but it seems to function more like a function area and so on. And then, of course, what happens is that within that area, it's regularly crossed by all the local inhabitants because it's not utilized by the so-called tourists. So once I'm there, I realize, okay, these are my people. These are the people I have to deal with. Whatever work I might think I'm making here, this work will go for them. They must feel like the work belongs to them. They must feel like they have some ownership over this work, because really the one or two government officials who will come and visit on the opening day and look at the work and clap their hands, this work has very little meaning for them. So I think, you know, after spending a couple of days there, talking to the local community, seeing what they do, just sitting and seeing what they do, kids then becoming friendly and coming to speak to you and find out who you are, why are you here, what are you doing, and so on. You know, at that point, I realized, okay, let's make something for this group of people, something they can see as they wake up in the morning, this thing is changing. At night, it's changed again. And slowly but surely, there's a transformation of their ordinary landscape. And by the end of it, it would be a secret that they would keep with them. They would understand the entire process. And really what happened then is that we started working and suddenly the local community was very interested. They would come by. The kids would run around in the thing as much as they can. You'd come back in the morning and it'd be a disaster because they played in it. And then you'd have yellow, by the end of it, we had yellow footprints running all over the park, which I thought was absolutely delightful. And so really what then ends up happening is that they see this thing unfolding, they know it's there. And the work, I hope, belongs to them and to their particular memory of that place and that time, without necessarily having to understand its art. So I think then onto the second kind of question is, well, the politician, well, the official delegation who came then for the opening, they were less pleased about it because this was a government initiative and so on. But to his credit, the national secretary, the secretary of the province there, Anjali Singh, he listened to the story and he laughed about it. It didn't necessarily please him, but he could understand the gesture. I think for the rest of them, they were less pleased about having spent all this money on sending someone here to make something hidden. But for me personally, I think it was a wonderful experience to work with the laborers, to just be there, be present, be visible, not ask too much from anyone else, and simply kind of go through that time as an experience, you know. Yeah, by the end of it, I mean, the work is now, of course, completely disappeared. It doesn't appear anywhere, only the couple of photographs survive, which is a different discussion altogether, but I hope that answers the question.
Wonderful. We're coming towards the end of our time together, but I just want to address one more collective question before we conclude. This comes from Monica Bryant. The discussion is really adding substance to my current research on the Cave Bureau based out of Nairobi. Thank you. My question, there is a lot of activism and discussion on changing the museum from its colonial roots. I'm interested in your perspective or vision on museums as a dynamic African place. In what way would current museology change to perpetuate this understanding, practice of Africanness?
Olu?
The museum as a dynamic place. Can it reflect dynamic Africanness?
What do you think, Olu? You've been longer in the game than I am. I'm slightly less optimistic about this particular idea unless we reformulate the very notion of a museum.
I think the museum has its place. I actually think that it can be a fantastic institution, but it's also an institution with a history, right?
Right.
We have to remember how museums began. Museums began as initially as collections of the merchant class who'd made so much money from either slavery or other forms of trade, oil in America, for instance, and then who traveled the world with this wealth and collected things for themselves, for their homes, and intend people with those things they collected represent their ideas of different cultures, but also representing their worldliness.
Mm.
And then eventually decided to donate those collections for the public enlightenment of the lesser classes, but also as manifestations of their ego. They either donated them in situ, in which case they would make the collection a museum, or they would endow to build a public space where their collection can go for the rest of the community to have access to it. That's the history of museums. But over time, it has been slowly transforming. Although that crust of history is still there, like where were these things collected from and how? And they weren't always stuff stolen by colonial governments. Some of them were spirited away by individuals as well on the black market, and it's a big, nasty, dark, vicious market that will steal anything, as long as there's a market for it, as long as there's someone who's willing to pay good money for it. But I think the onus is on the people who work in these spaces. And in a sense, I share some of Johan's, I don't want to say pessimism, but doubts, looking at the generations that have succeeded, the generations that were there when I got into, when I began to engage with these institutions. The almost certainty was that a younger generation are going to come up and they're going to take over and they're going to transform things, and they're going to take into consideration all of the work that many of us did to call attention to questionable practices. But I don't really see much of that happening as yet. You have to keep hope alive, as a certain famous preacher said. You have to keep hope alive. But museums can do that. I mean, as potential, why not? They can do that. And other people can also set up museums. I mean, individuals that set up museums, right? It doesn't have to be governments. So individuals can also set up museums that do things differently. And I think such museums probably exist. However, at the end of the day, to be a prestigious museum is almost like what they say, what Jesus says in the Bible. It says, that it's going to be easier for a horse to pass the eye of the needle than for a wealthy man to see the kingdom of God. So it's going to be very hard for anyone who's going to set up a prestigious museum to be immaculate.
Yeah, Olu, just on that, I think something that changed a lot in South Africa, when I finished studying and so on, sure, we had that spotlight in South Africa during the late 90s, and a lot of artists made it out of South Africa onto the international shores and so on. And they weren't producing commercial work, for example. the art world, if you like, was much less formalized than it is these days. And I think for me, that is a real pity, because I like the less formal art world. I like the fact that you had freedom then. Moshe Kwalanga always said, he had the best time of his life before someone discovered him, because he could do all the works that he wanted and there was no market pressure. And these days, I even see it with young students. They can almost not think themselves outside the formalized market, which now includes museums. And that's a hilarious thing for me, because it's about your own agency. It's still possible to have great exhibitions in your small flat. Invite good artists to do it. Although more and more I'm wondering whether artists would agree to do those shows, because they now all get big budgets for things and so on. But it's still possible, and I think that is a thing that's very close to my own heart now. Because
what is saddest actually, sorry, Johan, what is saddest actually is that many museums that then transformed into the other kind of institutions began exactly that way, right? The new museum in the kitchen, right? Or I don't know, Hans-Ulrich Obrist also started showing artists in his flat.
Yes,
and then
exactly.
Becomes Hans-Ulrich Obrist, the
with whom
God at the St. Peter at the gate, deciding who gets in and who doesn't. So yeah, it's still being done, but it transforms very quickly. The market takes the market and the market sensibility, but also the practicality of sustainability, which is that even if it's your flat, you still have to pay bills, and very quickly people move into, you can do this, you can do that, you can monetize that, and so on. And so I think there's room for all those things. And I believe that they continue to exist in certain places. But yeah, when the market comes in, and some of us would take some of the blame, right, for bringing all those New York curators to South Africa in '97. There's a busload of them. But it, it was good to see the wealth of creativity that existed in the place, and also to give people opportunity and to enable them in their individual practices, but also to be able to take care of their families and hopefully of their communities. I don't see much of the community taking care of, happening, but I certainly see the family aspect of it. I would like to see more of the community, but some of my own generation of artists who were picked up by the market and who could adapt to the market game are giving back to communities. They're setting up artist residencies, and I wish, sometimes I think to myself, I should have done that, because I prefer to provide opportunities for other artists, with residencies and building foundations and so on, and grants, than just be a poor artist who can't pay my own bills. But there's room for all kinds of positive things to happen. Whether they're happening or not is a different question.
I think maybe just by way of some humor and just returning to the topic of our conversation, when I mentioned to a friend of mine who's an art critic that we're discussing the expanded field of sculpture, and of course, everyone knows the essay, and everyone thinks, Joseph Beuys and the 7,000 Oaks, and so somewhat humorously, he said, well, when are people going to discuss the retracted field of sculpture? By which he means, the easy work that now dominates everywhere. I see there was a comment at some point about easy figuration and so on, and of course that's the market,
Yeah. You addressed that. You addressed the figuration question. I'll leave that to you.
Look, I mean, the market is powerful. I think we have to understand it, and it needs certain things. But
people have needs. People have needs as well. Not everyone has a university job like I used to have, or like you have, or,
Exactly.
you know, so people have, but not everyone has the qualifications to get those jobs. They're very competitive as well. So if you have creativity, and I always make this point, I don't want to drag us too far into time, but I always make this point that art practice can also be a profession and a different understanding of it, because it's always been that way throughout time. You know, in my presentation, I mentioned sarcastically, I mentioned Phidias in Greece. He was a professional sculptor. You know, he had commissions and he was a wealthy man, you know. That's how he made his living. There are the court painters of Renaissance Europe. That's how they made their living. And one of the, as far as I'm concerned, one of the reasons Vincent van Gogh took his life, it had nothing to do with regular illness, although he had illnesses like everyone else. But it was the frustration of feeling worthless, because people were constantly buying work by his contemporaries and his friends and simply ignored his, no matter what he tried. So, you know, and he came from the second most influential art market family in Europe. His uncle was the second most powerful person in the global art market at that time. And yet they couldn't sell a single work of his, not one, not his brother, not his uncle, nobody could sell a thing. And that did damage to his sense of self and worth and value as an artist, because others were, you know, and began to give away his work and to throw them away and so on and so forth. It's very, very frustrating. But practically for artists who have to survive just as artists, and who do not have qualifications to take jobs and so on and so forth, it's important to be able to make a living. So when the market comes calling and says your work is valuable, and it's thus valuable, it's not just valuable, but it's actually thus valuable, that's particularly positive for the person's sense of worth in that regard. While I may just feel that my work, by its very form and nature and creativity and smartness and so on, is enough for me to understand my sense of worth. For others, just being validated is very important. And that people then abuse it. It's in the nature of the market that things will get abused.
True.
Well, I am certainly grateful for this conversation today, and I will add that Dr. George Smith from IDSVA also gives his thanks to Olu and Johan for their rich contribution to this question of Africanness and for this discussion today. So I am so full and so grateful from this wonderful conversation, and I thank you so much.